The blade of moonlight sliced his face open with its honesty before the soldiers could. He gripped Mara's wrist as if holding himself upright, teeth bared, not in anger, but in a kind of pleading she had never seen him give anyone, least of all herself. "Marry me." Kale Thorne's king, Kale's king, the alpha with scars like a map to old wars, said, voice rough as gravel and velvet at once. "Bear me an heir, Mara Vance. Bind your blood to mine, and I will give you everything I have. The Crescent Courts will protect your ward. Your teacher will live. You will not watch them die because of me." He leaned forward as if the confession might shatter him. Blood that was not his, an old wound, a ceremonial nick, dappled his knuckles. The air tasted of salt and iron and the promise of violence. Around them, the city hummed with 1,000 small betrayals. Mara felt the veil sense curl at the edges of his words like fingers on the back of her neck. The mark beneath his ear pulsed, a bruise beneath immortality. "Say yes," he whispered, and the whole of the Crescent Courts seemed to hinge on the syllable. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He had offered bargains before, gifts draped in politics, promises that smelled faintly of smoke and oath blood. But this was different. A private ultimatum in the market square under a bruised sky, where children traded superstition for pennies and gargoyles watched with indifferent eyes. Mara could hear the crowd like ocean behind the stall awnings, a ripple of hunger, of curiosity, and the sharp animal thrill when royalty bared its teeth. Kale, the king, the alpha of the Crescent Courts, iron-jawed, quartered with old blood, immortal, was not supposed to plead. To confess was to cradle a weakness, and he had never done that unless the world itself was on fire. The mark he carried since birth, the oracle's carving into bone, was eating at his edges. The next blood moon was coming, and it threatened to finish its sentence. Mara's first instinct was to flee. She had spent the last 3 years running from the courts that harvested witches the way farmers harvest wheat. Her teacher, old Nara, had stitched sigils into the hems of the poor to keep them invisible to curses and hungry predators. Nara had told Mara the veil sense would be a blessing if she kept it secret, a death sentence if she wore it like a flag. When the royal heralds had started asking for apprentices, when the Crescent Courts had sent envoys with velvet and vipers to bargain for witch blood, Mara had tucked her gifts into the small seams of her life and vanished into the salt and smoke alleys. She had not expected the king himself to find the one place she could not hide. "You think marriage will buy me?" Mara heard herself ask. Her voice was steadier than she felt. The veil sense bit at the verb buy, because bargains had an undertow, and she had been swept by them before. Kale's eyes were too tired to be cruel. They held the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with ruling and everything to do with a private terror. "And if I refuse, if I leave and you die, what then? You ask me to give the thing I feared to give even to my own reflection." Around them, the market stilled. Merchants paused with apricots on scales. A child dropped a borrowed coin that clinked like a tiny accusation. The king's guards stood like teeth in the shadow of the crescent spires, and at their leader's shoulder, Kale's right hand, an old friend once, a love in another life, watched with a thickness in his jaw that Mara did not trust. Kale Thorne's lieutenant, front and center, was the man who had once been everything the Alpha could let himself be, fierce and honest in a way the court could not afford. Now he was a wall between the king and the world, eyes like flint, body coiled to unmake anyone who might hurt what the throne had claimed. "Kale," the king said, softer, as if the name could hold the weight of their history. The mention of it was like smearing salt across Mara's lungs. She had not thought she would ever hear the two of them, King and Beta, speak in anything but formality. But the way Kale's fingers curled, notebook-lifted jaw and all, told another story. He had loved and lost, and he carried that loss in the muscles of his face. The tremor in his hands did not belong to fear of battle, but to a private, broken promise. He had made a pact once, years ago, a thing buried in blood and the old tongue, that now hummed under the king's curse like a second ring of teeth. "You can't bargain fate with paper," Mara said, because truth had teeth too. Oracles carve their words in bone for a reason. The mark takes what it wants. "And what if it takes only what is willing?" Kale's voice rasped. He stepped closer, and the world narrowed to the space between them. The oracle's claws. There are loopholes. There are ways the old ones used to cheat the wheel. Your blood, Mara. It is rare. It senses curses. Witches can bend the appetite of fate if they know how to feed it. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away. That was the dangerous part. She felt his pulse through her skin, the rhythm of a life that had been tempered by millennia and recent fear. "Marami, bear my heir. The child will be bound, and the mark will not find death in me. It will find a different fullness. It will be fed, but not fulfilled." The imagery of being eaten and fed, two versions of the same cruelty, made Mara's mouth dry. "And what of my choice?" she demanded. "What of consent? You offer my life, my body, my blood as a loophole like I'm a tool. You'd steal my future to save your own." He flinched like a man struck. The guards shifted, a murmur rolled through the crowd as the word consent landed between them like a thrown stone. The king was a monarch used to people moving for him. He had signed pacts and taken hostages and traded daughters between houses. But there was a crack in him now, and from that crack leaked a raw need so large it resembled humility. "I would give everything to you," he said. "Everything I have, lands, protection, my crown. I will make you queen. I will make sure Nara and the ward are safe. I will ensure witches walk openly and not as prey. I will unbind your coven from being tribute. I will do what it takes." Promises like that smelled, faintly, of salvation, and subtly of compulsion. Mara's veil sense tightened, tasting the aftertaste of other people's oaths the way one tastes smoke after a fire. The witch's apprentice in her remembered the nights in Nara's kitchen, the hours bent over fabric, the sound of sigils being whispered like lullabies to keep children from seeing the things that ate hope. Those children were hers in a way politics could never own. If the Crescent courts withdrew, those alleys would become a feast. Rival packs, vampire elders hungry for witch-signed blood, and human mobs quick to burn what they didn't understand. She had seen the first waves of violence when witches were taken. She had sewed the sigils into hems and watched boys grow up ignorant and whole. The thought of sending Nara back into the maw made something in her clench. "Why me?" she asked. "Why a witch from the human wards? Why not take a noble bride, a bound coven matriarch, someone who would give you a child without bargaining for a neighborhood?" Because noble blood meant vampires had first claim. Because matriarchs of covens came with their own debts and blood warrants. Because your kind's power isn't the rawest kind, mine is. Because the veil sense feels the mark like breath on her neck. Because he loved her once and remembers how she turned his loneliness into a dangerous, tender thing. Kale did not speak the reasons. They were a map of alliances and betrayals that the Crescent courts had learned to navigate with knives. "You need me," Mara said flatly, and there was no condemnation in it, only fact. The veil sense thrummed. This was the point where destiny and desperation braided into a single rope. The mark on the king's neck pulsed like a second heart. The moon would be full in less than a fortnight. The oracle's bone was patient, but also precise. It had never been wrong. If the mark fed on willing sacrifice, then offering someone willingly might be the precipice it wanted. But if the mark demanded the taste of willing blood, then binding an heir could be the feast that ended him, or the ritual that kept him. She could not parse which without knowing what the mark really craved. "And what of Kale?" she asked. Not just the beta at the guard's shoulder, but the man who had once been close enough to break the king open. Kale's shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened until the ivory of his teeth showed. He looked like a man who had kept a secret under his tongue until it turned into poison. "The Knight," Kale said. Or perhaps he said the name of an old pact. He did not have to elaborate for Mara to understand. He had been the keeper of a promise that kept the king alive at a cost. She saw the ghost of that bargain in the way Kale avoided the king's eyes, in the posture that was at once defiant and resigned. He would not betray the throne, but he would not willingly let the king be used either. The dilemma settled over Mara like a shroud. Say yes and risk being a key someone else used to rewrite destiny, dooming herself to a life bound to a crown that would always hunger. Say no and watch the wards. Nara, the children, the patchwork family stitched together by sigils, fall into a violence she could not stop. Between the two options lay Kale, the throb of his secret, and the mark that only the moon and the oracle seemed to understand. The market exhaled around them, leaving only the smell of iron and salt and a future that tasted like the sea before a storm. She placed her palm over the king's scarred hand because that was the only honest thing she knew to do. It did not mean yes, nor did it mean no. It meant she would stay in the field where fates were decided and not run. It meant she would listen. It meant she would fight for a way the oracle had not thought to carve. The moon, the blood moon yet to come, woke the city to an old, hungry rhythm. And in the space between two heartbeats, Mara understood that whatever choice she made would mark her in as permanent a way as any rune. The market's breath fogged in front of Kale's mouth, and when he exhaled, the sound was small and dangerous. Around them, life resumed its noisy insistence. Apricots were weighed, a kid chased a dog, a woman laughed too loudly to pretend she hadn't heard the king's proposal. But the air between Mara and Kale held a different weather. It smelled of old iron and new fear. Mara felt the veil sense like a hand on the back of her mind. Curses she had never learned to name brushed her like moths against hot skin. They were curious, smelling the bargain, testing edges. "Give me until I can speak to Nara," Mara said finally, and the words came out like a trade. A life for a chance to save others. It was a bargain she hadn't meant to make, but the city itself had shifted beneath her feet, revealing cracks where predators might fall. "Let me bind a sigil to the wards. Let me see if there is a way to feed the mark without becoming a leash." The king's jaw flexed. He had expected defiance, possibly a cold dismissal, or an outright refusal that would allow him to take the matter into the back rooms where decisions are made with less noise and more knives. He had not expected pleading prudence. Relief flickered across his face like a moth at a flame, then shuddered. "You will have 2 nights," he said. "Do not take advantage of my mercy." 2 nights felt like a small, brittle thing. Only enough time to scratch the surface of a bone-deep curse. Mara knew how much work it took to stitch new intent into old vows. The apothecaries of the lower wards dealt in hours and patience. The sigils old Nara taught were slow, layered, beadwork of meaning and counter-meaning. To reweave an oracle's claws meant daring study, dangerous rites, and access to libraries that required a certain blood price. The Crescent Courts held those volumes in vaults men called holy and monsters called prison. Cale's offer had opened one door. Behind the door lay corridors and watchful eyes. She stepped back from his hand and felt, in that small retraction, the old vertigo of being owned. The guards shifted inward, protective and also possessive. Power begets proximity, and proximity becomes control. Even if the king meant the gift he offered, legitimizing witches within the court would take more than a crown's pronouncement. It would require allies inside covens, pacified vampires, and the renunciation of old hunts. It would mean changing rituals that had fed centuries of fear. Mara's throat worked around the enormity of it. Her first stop was the narrow hall that led to old Nara's kitchen, a route through alleys that smelled of damp bread and river silt. Nara sat at her table with a moon cup dangling from a string over her head, its light catching the stitches Mara had once learned under that very lamp. Old Nara's hands were a roadmap of scars, each one a spell kept alive. When Mara told her what the Alpha had demanded, Nara's face folded into grief so swift and plain it made Mara blink. "You knew someone would try to use it," Nara said. She did not look toward the window where merchants hawked imported silks. Her concern was inward, toward a memory of a night when witches had paid for pacts with their blood. Power asks for names, and then it asks for faces. "I didn't want this for you," Mara murmured. The veil sense hummed louder, like a radio tuned to static, as though the market's appetites were a chorus behind the old woman. Mara mapped the wards with a glance. Children asleep beneath patched quilts, a line of sigils stitched into the hems of coats, the bone talismans beneath pillows. This place was a web of small protections, so fragile in the face of a court used to taking what it wanted. Nara's eyes, which had always been the color of rainwater on pewter, softened. "You are good," she said simply. "You always were. But goodness is a thorn when kingdoms need pricks." There was no bitterness, only the patient, practical weariness of those who had watched saints and sinners alike traded like livestock. If you choose to go into the court, do not be naive. They will praise you, and they will try to bind you into something you cannot unmake. They will dress compulsion as charity. Mara tasted bile, the memory of a trade she had once watched. A witch given succor, then bound so tightly to a lord's lineage that even her children could not walk without permission. It had been after a harvest when the vampires came to negotiate debts, and the witch's daughter had been married at dawn to a lord whose teeth were gold. The child had grown into a woman with hollow eyes and a stitched mouth. The story had been a whispered lesson in Nara's kitchen for decades, a warning sewn along with the sigils. Mara had been determined not to become a cautionary tale. "We can bind differently," Mara said. "Not blood to blood, but will to will. Consent is not just the word, it is the thing. If the wheel is hungry for willing sacrifice, we can teach it to accept consenting guardians instead of sacrificial lambs." Nara touched Mara's knuckle. Her skin was warmer than Mara expected, and for a stuttering moment, the old woman's face looked younger, like a memory of laughter at a river's edge. "That is a dangerous thing to teach to a king," she said. "Kings like to think they are the only ones who make rules." "What about Kyle?" Mara asked. The name left more questions than answers now. How far had the pact gone? What debt slept in the ribs of that silent man? If he is the fault line in this, he will not let the king be used. He will either break something to save him, or bind the king tighter to keep him alive. Which is worse? Nara's laugh was a ragged thing. "Both," she said. They are twins, but where one takes, the other mends. Find Kael and speak to him straight. He will not soften his choices, but he will show you the edges. And Mara, if you bind anything to the king, put in clauses like a lawyer and charms like a mother. Do not leave him agency only to take it away with a ring. Mara left the kitchen with bundles of thread and a worn satchel of powders Nara thrust into her hands unbidden. Do not trust the corridors, Nara added as Mara crossed the threshold. Trust only the light in a person's eyes. If it reminds you of a sea you once loved, be careful. The sea claims things with a grin. Her next stop was the barracks, where she found Kael watching guards drill with a precision that was almost meditation. He looked as if he had been carved from shadows and grief, every movement honed to usefulness. When he saw Mara, his face rearranged itself into something softer, less the chiseled soldier and more the man who had once let himself fall to small joys. There was a chord in her chest that strained at the sight of him, an old pulley that had lifted and lowered feelings she had thought she had abandoned. "You spoke to Nara," Kael said before she could say anything. The statement was not a question. He led her along the practice yard to a bench where shadows made a quilt. "She gave you kits. She gave me her blessing once, and I kept a record. She tends nests, and she also keeps accounts of pacts. If she gives you thread, she expects you to sew cautiously." "Is that what you want?" Mara asked, and the question was sudden and small. "Do you want me to sew the king into something he cannot leave?" Kael cocked his head the way a dog listens to a faint noise. "I want whatever will save him and let him remain himself," he said. The words were simple. They carried the weight of someone who had discovered the shape of his own practical love and had welded it into vow. If that means drawing a cage against death's face so the man can continue to choose, then so be it. If it means loosening an old knot he tied for wrong reasons, then I will cut it. But I will not let him be flayed. I would rather die myself than watch him become a thing." "I thought you loved him once for how he became a thing," Mara said, "because it was true. The king had been lonely in ways that made him dangerous. Kael had loved that loneliness and tried to keep it whole. You loved his solitude." "I loved his truth," Kael corrected softly. "Solitude is simple. Truth is a landscape. I loved a landscape I could stand on with him. Somewhere along the line, the landscape became a battlefield, and I learned to carry stones. That is not the same as loving a cage." His hand brushed hers. It was a contact that could have been partners meeting in the dark or counsel between soldiers. It was not a proposal. It was a shared solidity. Mara felt the veil sense curve inwards, almost honoring the steadiness of the man beside her. Kael's presence was both a comfort and an accusation. He was the living proof of what the king stood to lose and what the court would do to save itself. They were interrupted by a messenger, a young courier with a mouth full of smoke and an urgency that made his fingers tremble. He handed Kael a strip of leather, a notice stamped with an emblem Mara recognized too well, the seal of the vampire elders. "Riot at the West Bridge," the man said. "They say a witch has been taken. The crowd's hungry. They want spectacles." The word took the air out of them both. Another witch taken. The rumor would spread like diluted coal. The market would buzz, then boil. Vampires had always used such moments to renegotiate terms, to remind courts which predators still had teeth. If a witch was being paraded, a ransom, a show of power, the delicate negotiation Mara hoped to buy with 2 nights would die in righteous fury, and the Crescent courts might do something cruel to keep the streets calm. "You cannot allow them to parade a witch," Kael said without thinking it through. His jaw hardened. If they bring one through the square, I will stop it." "You will not stop it by force alone," Mara answered. Her veil sense was aflare now, sensing a knot of curses surrounding the bridge. Angry magic, old grudges, rituals wrapping the victim like a hunting net. "You will need counsels, signatures from witches, a sign from the elders. Otherwise it will be bone to tooth." Kale's fingers tightened. "Then find them," he said. "Speak to the elders. Use what leverage we can. If the vampires are demanding a child other than the one we hope for, they may try to take one by force." Mara thought of the market, the apricots, and old Nara's hands. She thought of a child bound and dragged across a bridge to prove a point. The veil sense screamed not in words, but in the refuse of images. A white dress ripped, a sigil smudged, teeth bared. Her stomach turned. "All right," she said. "Let me go. Let me see the bridge. Let me see what the elders want. Perhaps we can stall them, find out if they seek to bargain." Kale's profile softened a fraction. "You are brave to your own ruin," he murmured. "Don't let it be literal." They moved toward Westbridge with the haste of two people who had suddenly remembered how to be useful. As they walked, the city rearranged itself. Banners that had been placidly hanging now seemed to flicker in anxious rhythms. Alley cats slunk like conspirators, and children who had earlier traded pennies now peered from doorways with the solemnity of those who know to hide when powerful things meet. When they reached the bridge, a crowd had already gathered. The vampire elders' banners hung like predatory moths, their sigils catching the dusk. The bridge itself was lined in bodies, some human, some shifter faces tense with assertion, some cloaked figures whose eyes shone like inset jewels. At the center, beneath a makeshift dais, a witch stood with hands bound, her head bowed. She wore a ribbon of white and a mark around her throat that pulsed like a heart. Mara felt the space around the woman as if it were a physical presence. Fear braided with stubbornness, a secret poetry that did not belong to the elders. The crowd clapped when the elders stepped forward, applause like knives. One raised a hand, and the sound fell into a hush so total it suffocated. The elder's voice was honeyed and slow. "We have come," he said, "to remind all that the old orders require balance. There must be tribute." Mara knew tribute. She had lived at the sharp edge of it. But she also knew there were other ways to make balance without making martyrs. She found Kale's hand under her sleeve and squeezed, an anchor and a plea. He met her gaze, and in it was the same calculation she had seen 100 times, a soldier measuring risk. "You will not make her a sacrifice tonight," Mara told the elder, and there was insult in the steadiness of her voice, an accusation wrapped in glass. The elder smiled, an expression that seemed to peel away like varnish. "We will not let your teeth be bared upon our wards." Around them, the crowd shifted as if a storm had been named. That rippling anxiety was the unmistakable beginning of escalation. The elders would not be dismissed by one witch in a dirty dress. The market would not stand idle while a coronation of cruelty played out on a bridge. And above all, the moon kept turning toward the full, patient, inevitable as an ocean. Mara felt the choice pull at her again, to stay and fight for the streets she loved, or to accept a throne's bargain and buy safety with the lease on her own freedom. Between the two, Kale and the king stood like opposing magnets, each tugging at the compass of her heart. The day was not yet done, but the first skirmishes of power were being drawn in the dust. The next move would shape the rest of them. The witch on the dais looked like someone who had chosen her own end and then found the option rescinded. Her eyes, rimmed with anger and a fatigue that could not be cured by sleep, found Mara as if searching for a knife that might also be a map. The elder's honeyed voice curled through the crowd like smoke, and men who had once been children in Mara's ward now shifted their feet and nodded as if they had been taught to applaud cruelty. "You will not make her a sacrifice tonight," Mara had said, and the world narrowed to the beating of a single word, "No," and all the things that could follow it. The elder's smile did not crumble so much as rearrange into a sharper geometry. "Balance must be paid," he replied. "The Crescent Courts have offered a future bride. We remind them, the old ways prefer a pure claim." At the word pure, the witch on the dais flinched. Pure, for the elders, meant nobility, the right kind of lineage their grudges could taste without bitter afternotes. "Not ours," K.L. said from Mara's side. His voice was a blade wrapped in linen. It would cut if he chose to use it. "You will not parade a witch to feed your politics. There is a measure in speech, what is said aloud and what is kept as a thing between teeth." K.L. had guarded an entire continent of secrets in the tightness of his jaw. Mara had assumed most of them were for the king, for the court, for the survival of a monarchy that had stitched itself together with blood and treaty. She had not known, could not have guessed, that the secret folded into him like a small sleeping animal was the kind that gnawed at the foundation. In the pause after his words, the elder's emissary produced a slip of vellum and thrust it at K.L. The seal was old and tasted of ash and autumn, a summons, written in the decrepit script the elders used for debts that could not be repaid. K.L. read it like a man would read a verdict. His face went a different shade of bone, as if someone had painted grief across him. The crowd shifted, the bridge hummed with the low anticipatory sigh of beasts who smell blood even when none is yet spilled. "What is it?" Mara asked. She didn't mean to be impatient, but fury is often the only language left when options are knives and none feel like they will land on the right part of you. He swallowed. The action was almost theatrically banal. "An old clause," he said. "A challenge from the elders. They claim—" He stopped, and for a moment the watchfulness that cloaked him peeled away, revealing a man nightmare of responsibility. "They claim the heir they will accept must be of elder-acknowledged blood. They demand a child sired by a lineage in season with theirs. So they want a noble," Mara finished. Her veil sense fizzed like a touch to the open flesh. "So they ask for what they always ask for, something the court cannot give without burning the wrong things." "They ask for more than that," K.L. said. "They ask for a willing tribute." The words landed with a sound like a stone falling into a well. Mara's muscles remembered. Willing tribute. The oracle's clause had always implied hunger, but here was the procurement form, a request for consent written in a language of teeth. The elders wanted a child born of willing sacrifice. The mark fed on choice, and choice could be bribed, coerced, or apparently procured with promises. The witch on the dais began to speak, but the elder cut her off. "We are not barbarians," he said. "We only enforce what is written. If the Crescent Courts cannot offer, we will take what is owed." And then the whole thing unraveled in a dozen ways at once. From the crowd came a shout, then another, then the hollowing chant that spreads like a disease. The humans, long hurt by the courts, wanted a spectacle. Vampires in the periphery licked their lips. Shifters bargained with one another in low huffs that sounded like hunger. If the elders moved to seize a witch, the court would have to decide whether to fight in public and validate the mob, or to give ground and make a trade that would ruin the ward's fragile safety. Mara felt the veil sense hitched in her spine like a hand closing around a book that she had not yet read. The fields of threat unfolded. The elders wanted a child of particular provenance. The king wanted an heir whose blood would bind the mark, And Kael had, Mara realized with a coldness that made her teeth ache, kept something from them both. The way his hands trembled now, the way his mouth pressed into a line, told a different story than the one he'd been giving. "Tell me," she said, and it was not a request. "Tell me what you didn't tell him." His laugh was sudden and brittle. "You think I kept secrets to hurt him? You think I kept something that would break him?" "I think you kept something that would break us," Mara said. She spoke for the ward, for Nara, for every stitch of quiet protection folded into the hems of children's coats. And you may have kept it so you could fix things without anyone knowing. Kael's eyes shone, and in them Mara saw an ancient regret. "When the king first bore the oracle's mark, we made a pact," he said, "a binding to hold him in place while we searched for solutions. I swore the old thing, an oath to tether death to a particular law. I promised to keep him alive at the cost of certain freedoms. I told myself I was buying time. I told myself I would break the chain when I found better methods. Instead, the chain became part of the bed. The revelation struck like thunder. An oath that traded liberty for life is a currency the courts had always minted. But the particular cruelty here was layered. The binding had not only sought to protect the king from the oracle, it had, according to Kael's quiet admission, shaped the conditions the oracle sought. He had become the midwife to the very appetite they now hoped to quiet. "You were supposed to be the breaker," Mara said. "You were supposed to cut ties, not make them weave tighter." He closed his eyes. "I made a choice," he admitted, small as a child's lie. "I was young and terrified, and I thought the only way to keep him was to ensure the law that threatened him could be negotiated. I swore to the elders for leverage. I promised them something I could not deliver without a heart to offer. I thought, stupidly, that I could control the bargain. Control is the oldest superstition of men who rule. The throne feeds on it, and those nearest the throne learn to seat their minds around that hunger. Kael had done what many gods and generals did, offered pieces of the world to keep other pieces whole. The consequences landed now like unpaid bills. The elder snaked forward, sensing weakness. "Ah," he purred, "so your keeper is honest. The crown is adrift. We can offer a solution. A child we accept, one born with the requisite blood and presented willingly. The king need not die. Our terms are civil." "Your terms are theft," Mara said. The heat in her chest was fierce. "You would turn consent into a commodity. You'd auction a child's life." The elder's eye slitted. "We would ensure balance." "No," Mara said. "You would ensure your dominion." Above the bridge, the moon rode higher, indifferent. Its pale face would soon be full and sharp and hungry, and the old bone would be listening for the taste of choice. In the precarious knuckle of power between a monarch who had once been a man and a council that prized lineage over mercy, the first crack of betrayals widened into a chasm. Kael's next move was the thing that blew small holes through Mara's heart in a geometry she hadn't expected. He turned not to the elder, but to the king, who had arrived at the bridge between Mara and the dais like an omen in a cloak. The Alpha looked at Kael like a man who had been betrayed by scripture and fellow saints at once. For a heartbeat, the court monarch looked smaller than the marketplace kids who threw stones when the king's carriage went by. "Did you tell them we could bind a witch and cheat the bone?" the king demanded. He didn't scream. He asked with the flat, hard hurt of a man who had thought his life was secured by those he trusted. Kael's head could have been cut from the shoulders of something else. "I told them we had options," he said. I told them we might present a child. I promised a negotiation. I did not promise you would become some offering." The king's laugh was a flayed sound. "You promised a negotiation to the ones who will not be satisfied with words. You promised them the shape of a child, and perhaps a body. You made creditors of hungry things and forgot what you had to pay. Betrayal is not a single act, but a pattern, a list of things kept secret, a history rewritten." The king's eyes burned with the knowledge that the pact meant someone would be asked to give everything. He turned to Mara, and for a moment all present felt the thrust of being chosen as if by a blade. "You are offering me as barter," the king said. It was the simplest possible summation, but when he said it, the air around them changed. The guards stepped forward, not in menace, but in the reflex of ownership. "Is that why you needed her 2 nights? To rope my court into a plan you can manipulate?" Mara's breath hitched. For the first time, she understood the full cruelty of the position she had been nudged into, a chess piece cupped in sticky palms. She had not known Cal's promise would become a weapon pointed back at the king and used to force confession. She had not known that the man she had come to trust as a ballast between danger and mercy might have been the architect of a new danger. "I asked for 2 nights to speak to Nara," she said. Her voice, held too long, had begun to fray. "To see if we could build something that saved people without handing them to teeth. If it looks now like I am an instrument, then perhaps I am, but I will not be used." The king's look was not the one that had once convinced Mara to stay with the court. It was the look of a monarch betrayed and also contradicted. "You speak as if you have a choice," he said. "Choice is what the mark demands." "Choice is what I will give," Mara snapped. She had the sudden, galvanizing clarity that comes when fear becomes fuel. If she was a lever to save people, she could choose how to use herself. "I will not allow you to make me a key without locks of my own." The bridge convulsed around them. Voices rose into a roaring. The elder spoke into the noise with a voice of practiced calm, but it was now woven with new threats, legalities and bargains, blackmail, and the promise of a future in which the wards would be grazing land for the powerful. The shifters gnashed teeth like a gathering storm. In that chorus, the fragile trust between Cale and the king fractured outward into 1,000 sharp things. "What did you promise them, Cale?" the king asked, smaller now, as if he were the one who had been kept as debt. Cale's reply was a whisper that the king should never have been the first to hear. "I promised leverage," he said. "I promised access to the court's inner chambers if they helped us stall the bone. I offered them a path to legitimate claim. He could not find a word that would undo what had been done. "I never meant to make you a thing." That was not enough. The king bristled, and something like fury flared, the kind that yanked Caesar from a chair. He ordered guards to encircle the elder. The elder smiled and produced counter-orders. Old bargains were pulled from dusty vaults and presented as rope. The crowd smelled the change. Fever, the metallic scent of escalation. Mara stood in the middle of the bridge with both men a little piece of her heart and life in their hands. The world felt fragile in a way she had only ever read in books, a thing bound with thin thread and destined to unfurl. She had come seeking an answer, a path to save the wards. Instead, she found systems hungry for hunger, men who would lie even to themselves to keep what they decided to hold on to. And beneath all of it, like the slow sound of a tide, the moon drew nearer to its full. It would require a willing thing to feed. Where the willing came from, and whether willing consent could be forged by promises or coerced by circumstance. These questions wound through the bridge like poison. In the face of that knot, Mara felt old scaffolding of trust collapse around her. Cale's half-truth, the king's plea that burned like a wound, the elder's thin-smiled hunger. She wanted to leave, to run again into alleys, to hide among apricots and sigils where decisions were made by hands that remembered sewing rather than ruling. Instead, she stepped forward, because both cowardice and courage require motion, and the city of stitched hems needed someone willing to act. "Enough," she said. The word was small, but it landed like an order. The crowd faltered. The elder looked like someone who had been scolded. "You will not take a child. You will not use my people as tokens. The court has half answers, and your teeth have grown long on fear. We will not." The king laughed then, and it was an ugly sound of a man who had been denied his most human comfort, complete control. "You speak of not using people as tokens which, while offering to give yourself as a tool?" Mara felt the ground tilt. Cale reached for her and missed. The king's hand gleamed with the faint tremor of a man used to being obeyed. Around them, alliances rearranged like muscle memory. Wings of loyalty flared and collapsed, and in the center, what remained was not resolution, but 1,000 new edges. Secrets had been cast into the open like spilled coins. Fractures had begun to stitch their own patterns. The bridge teemed with the knowledge that tomorrow would require tougher choices than the ones they had today, and that not everyone would survive those choices intact. The king's offer, Cale's secret, the elder's demand, they were not isolated woes, but the first notes of an orchestration that would either produce a miracle or a massacre. As the crowd hissed and the moon continued its slow pilgrimage toward hunger, Mara understood that she had stepped into a hall of mirrors. Everything that reflected back at her had been shaped by someone's deception. She would have to choose which mirror to smash and which to keep. The cost of that choice would be more than the 2 nights she had been granted. It would be the end of innocence, the beginning of a fight that would not stay on the bridge. And in the belly of that realization was the sharp, cold knowledge that the fractures already running through them had only just begun to split open. The sky above the bridge split with a ringing of wings as the first of the elder's guards surged, pale, precise, the predatory ballet of vampires who had never known hunger they could not control. The crowd's roar shattered into fighting cries. Someone struck a torch, and the light guttered like a throat. In the seconds that followed, everything happened in the quicksilver way of battles and confessions. A shove, a blade flashing. Cale moving like a shadow given sudden, incandescent purpose. "Hold the line," he shouted, voice carrying with the authority of a man who had answered 100 alarms and always bent them to order. His hand found Mara's wrist, and for an instant she did not know if she was steadied or pulled into a greater danger. The bridge bucked under the press of bodies, the smell of iron and fire and old blood spiking like cologne. The elder advanced as if they were stage managing a tragedy. "We will not be fooled by theatrics," he intoned, theatrically soothing. "If you cannot produce a willingly given heir, we will take what we need by other means." "You take nothing tonight," Mara said. Her voice, rawer than she had known it could be, cut across the bridge. She felt the veil sense spiking like a bell. Curses and threats braided into a coherent shape she could almost untie. Threads of protection, old and fragile, thrummed beneath the boards. She could smell the hunger like a storm on the horizon. "There is another way," Cale called, and everyone faltered. He stepped forward into the elder's light, and Mara saw in him the terrible calm of someone who had long ago decided he would carry any burden to spare others. He said, "You demand a willing offering. Here is one." Mara's skin went cold. She looked at him as if he'd become a different animal. "You can't be serious," she said. He was. His jaw tightened until veins showed like cords. "I made mistakes," he said, voice low enough that only Mara could hear the shame-threaded syllables. "I traded away truths, thinking I could buy the king more hours. I swore an oath. That oath has teeth. If the mark hungers for willing consent, then I will give it consent, consent of my own. I will take the appetite." "No," the king said. His voice cracked with something like terror and selfishness braided together. "You will not take that from me. I will not let you." "You will not get to decide this for me," Kyle snapped back. The sound was fierce enough to make the king flinch. Kyle turned to the crowd, to the elders, to the court that had always thought sacrifice clean when it was somewhere between someone else's hands. "I volunteer. I will take whatever the bone asks and bind it to myself. I will not be immortal because of it. I will be what you choose to make me." He searched Mara's face. "I do this willingly, not to be coerced, not because I owed anything, because I choose." Mara's veil sense screamed in a way that was not prophecy but pleading. She had known Kyle as protector, as secret-bearer, as the man who had kept the king from becoming untethered. But she had not been prepared for the shape of his love, a pragmatic, explosive thing that wanted to give his life to alter another's course. Her knees went soft as a child's. "You will not die today," she said, because it was all she could think to offer, even as the elder's gaze sharpened. "You will not be another casualty in this war of teeth and crowns." The elder's smile was a blade. "Then show us the proof of will. Show us the binding. If you weave a ritual that convinces us that the mark will be fed without a royal death, we will accept a child of your choosing. If not, we fight," Kyle finished. He drew Mara aside, even as guards closed around them. They found a sliver of shadow beneath an overturned cart. The market's remnants raised a palisade of crates and bitter fruit. Kale's fingers trembled as he drew a small blade and cut the lined vellum from his wrist, an old sigil scar, a language written in flesh. "I have been bound to an old oath," he said to Mara. "I can weave it into the new ritual, but it will cost me my wolf blood. The choice I make will be absolute. I would rather be mortal and enough than immortal and a loophole. If you are to bind anything to me, make it not slavery, but consent." Mara thought of old Nara's hands, of the stitched sigils, of children waking whole beneath patched quilts. She thought of the witch on the dais and the market crowd who would have traded flesh for spectacle. The veil sense flared until she could see threads of possibility. A binding that took not bloodline, but the deliberate exchange of agency. A ritual rooted in consent, tethering a hunger to a living will that would bear it without consuming others. She could build such a thing, but it required time, precision, and a willingness to make a sacrifice that felt like love. "Then we do it your way," she said. "We bind not a child to the bone, but a guardian to the appetite. You will carry it, Kale, but it must be with your consent and your voice." He took a breath that could have been a prayer and nodded. "Say the words," he said. "I will say the oath." Mara worked like a woman who had stitched protection into collars and hems. Quick fingers, precise knots, sigils drawn in breath and salt. She gathered the powders Nara had given her, the threads soaked in old prayers, and, like a surgeon, she began to weave a new rule. The elder watched with predatory interest, the king with a knowledge that his life would be altered by the math of consent, and the crowd with a feverish hunger for drama. Kale's voice was steady, clear as glass on the bones of a ritual. "I grant my will," he intoned when Mara's hands had wound the last thread. "I offer my life's light to bear the appetite you demand. I release the crown's claim upon my loyalty. I take the mark into myself and bind it to my choice." The elder hissed like a throat closing on a fly. Vampires shifted, doubt cracking across their veneers. The bridge held its breath. Mara began the counter-chant, not as command, but as pact. She threaded consent into syllables and wove protections into the space between words. The moon watched, an impartial judge. The mark at the king's neck pulsed as if pasting the air. Kale's own skin shivered under the ritual's pressure like a wire exposed. For a terrifying, luminous moment, she thought the earth would split open and the bones of the oracle send up their verdict. Then, something like a wind moved through Kale. It slid along his spine, warmed his skin, and for a second his pupils widened, not with shock, but with relief. The mark's glow left the king in a ribbon of pale smoke and coiled into Kale like a second heartbeat. He sagged, not with death, but with the release of a weight he'd carried for too long. Where once his fur had been a suggestion around his temples, it thinned, then withdrew. His shoulders, always taut with wolf-born tension, softened into human angles. He breathed in a way that was no longer wolf force, but mortal and fragile. The king collapsed to his knees, hands pressed to the space where the mark had lived. He stared at Kale with a grief that tasted like apology. "You," he began, and there were no words that could write the ledger between them. Kale looked at the king, then at Mara. His smile was tired and astonished. "I chose," he said simply. "I chose to be enough." Around them, the elder's posture shifted. The vampire's hunger found a different shape to taste, a living, willing human who had traded immortality for agency. It was not the feast they had wanted, and the politics of appetite are brittle when confronted with a sacrifice that refuses to be stolen. The elder, with all his teeth, felt the fight weaken in his hands. "We will accept this demonstration," he said, at last, his voice thin silk. "We will consider the new terms, if they are honored." Mara's hands trembled as she let the ritual's final threads slip through her fingers. Kale's pulse ticked under her palm, slower, human. He looked at her with something close to prayer. "You should rest," she said, absurd in the face of all that had just been traded. "I should have told you sooner," he whispered. "I thought saving him was the only thing left." "You saved him," Mara corrected, "and you saved something in me." He grinned, a poor, perfect thing. "We are both ridiculous." She laughed then, a release that had salt in it. Around them, the crowd's roar shifted from fury to the complicated hush of a moment that had unmade an old story and, perhaps, if they were brave, might begin to tell another. The king rose, hands shaking. He stepped forward and, without regal formality, without the command the crown had once required, he bowed to Kale. "For what you've given," he said, voice broken but steady, not a claim, but a gratitude that echoed with shame. Kale's answer was not a claim on the throne or a demand for ceremony. He looked at Mara, and whatever courtly titles might have once stood between them dissolved in the shelter of that look. "Keep me," he said, "not because I am needed, but because I choose it. If you would have me at your side as a man and not as a sword, then stay. I am mortal now. I am yours only if you ask me to be." Mara felt a strange, fierce relief, like surf after a storm. The veil sense, which had been a screaming litany for days, quieted into a hum. Around them, the bridge settled into a new geometry, a compromise stitched not by the teeth of predators, but through the fragile, human threads of consent. She kneaded Kyle's face in her palms like someone finding a map. "Stay," she said. "You will not be mine because I need you for bargains. You will be mine because you chose to be." He closed his eyes then, and when he opened them, the vulnerability was luminous. He leaned forward and kissed her. Not the calculated press of royal politics, but a real, dangerous kiss that tasted of everything they had almost lost and everything they might yet become. The elder watched the exchange, and the king watched, and the crowd watched. But for Mara, there was only the heat of Kyle's mouth and the steady, mortal pulse beneath her fingers. He had taken the mark, and the mark had not devoured him. Instead, he had turned an old appetite into a human burden, one they would carry together. As the moon rolled toward full, the first sirens of negotiation began among the elders and the court. The bridge would not be a place of final answers, but a crucible from which new law might be hammered. Among the bruised and the bleeding, the most radical thing had occurred. A man had chosen mortality rather than allow death as currency. A witch had insisted on consent as law. And a king had been denied the right to buy his way out of consequences without cost. Mara sat back on her heels, breath ragged, and looked at Kyle, the man who had traded centuries for a life he could hold in his hands. He was thin where once fur made him broader. His hands were human, with a smudge of sigil powder on one thumb. He laughed, a sound like a tired animal finally finding a bed. "You look less terrifying," she said. "Do I?" He kissed her brow, then rested his forehead to hers. "You look more dangerous." They held each other in the pale wash of a moon that had been cheated out of its sentence for the time being. Around them, bargains reopened and power scouted new lines. But in the small circle of breath between Mara and Kal, there was a vow. Not a crown's proclamation, not a binding carved in bone, just choice, chosen again and again. When the first elder's envoy finally moved to negotiate terms, they found not a woman reduced to sacrificial geometry, but a witch who had become a lawyer of the heart, and a man who had laid down his immortality as if it were a cloak. They found a king humbled into gratitude. And they found a city still alive because someone had refused to let the old rules be the end. There would be more cost to pay. The mark was only deferred, the political wounds not yet closed. But in those hard, luminous minutes after the ritual, Mara felt something like a future press into her palms, a future where bargains were balanced with consent, and where love could be a saving thing without being the substrate of a trap. Kal swallowed, hand in hers, the newness of mortality settling around him like a garment. "Whatever comes," he said, voice small and brave, "we face it together. I will carry this appetite, but I will not let it make you less." Mara tightened her fingers around his. The veil sense curled like a soft, cautious animal, finally given a name it could trust. "Then we will make a different law," she said, "one where no child is promised without voice, one where no witch is traded for peace." They rose together as the elder's envoy drew near, and the king, stripped of absolute entitlement, stepped forward to bargain for the wards he had once held as line items. The city exhaled, the hunger abating a fraction, and under the full moon's watchful eye, Kal and Mara moved back into the crowd, their fingers linked, their futures uncertain, their choice finally their own. The negotiations that followed were not the tidy decrees of fairy tale diplomacy, but a slow, stubborn unweaving of habit. Deals were rewoven at kitchen tables and in scriptoriums, not only beneath chandeliers and marble arches. Mara spent days drafting clauses with old Nara's ink-stained patience, translating oath language into something a human mouth could understand. Consent, revocation, guardianship, the right of a child to refuse a destiny written before its first breath. The elders grumbled, ancient things do, but the spectacle of Kale's choice hardened some of their teeth. Hunger, when met by will, loses its glamour. The king, less unmade by time than by humility, walked the wards with Mara at his side. He listened to the people he had ruled like a list. He met the children whose pillows had been sewn with talismans and the shopkeepers who had sheltered witches in basements. He learned the length of a promise by measuring it against the heat in a mother's eye. It was slow and messy. He apologized more than any crown ought to, and because apology is a muscle, he grew stronger in it. Kale learned the small economies of mortal life, how to sleep without the intrusive metallic dream of wolf sense, how to feel hunger as food and not as prophecy, how skin remembered sun. He laughed at the banality of being able to bleed and heal and bear the common aches of days. At night, in the narrow rooms above Nara's kitchen, he and Mara argued about cozy things, how to keep sigils from fraying in the wash, whether pets deserved crowns, and the arguments felt like the stitches of a life being hand-sewn rather than declared. They wrote the new law together, and it bore both their handwriting. Legal clauses threaded with sigils that forbade the sale of persons, rituals that required the vocal assent of the one being offered, and a guardian charter that would allow an adult to hold the appetite the oracle hungered for, if they chose. The pact released the king from a sentence he had only narrowly escaped, and turned the court into an imperfect, accountable body. The elders, hungry and dignified, agreed to oversight. The vampires learned that teeth do not always win. Months later, a child was born, not sired as a bargain, but welcomed after a courtship of consent and care that read like rebellion. The child's name was given by a chorus of voices, 2 parents, a teacher, a city that had voted for mercy. Mara watched the infant sleep beneath a blanket stitched with sigils she had layered like lullabies. Cal held the child's fingers, warm, stubborn little things, and marveled at how mortal fragility could be vast and brave. On the night the child first opened its eyes to the moon, Mara and Cal stood on the same bridge where bargains had once been shouted. The city around them slept in a peace that was not naive, but hard-earned. The moon, full and indifferent, poured silver over their joined hands. In the sheen of that light, the mark on the king's neck was only a faint scar. The appetite had a new shape, less a sentence than an instruction to guard. Mara felt the veil sense as a pale, contented thread, no longer a screaming claw, but the soft pulse of a thing finally named. They let the moon watch them like an old witness, and for once chose simply to be present. 2 people who had been asked to give everything and had instead learned how to give choice. The city breathed around them, stitched and fragile and unbowed, and in that fragile glow, Mara pressed her forehead to Cal's and, with the town and the moon as their jury, promised once more to protect, to resist coercion, to love without claiming. The moon listened, and then, as if granting a benediction, turned its face away to the rest of the sleeping world.